There is a mountain in the deserts of southeastern Iran that has not erupted in 700,000 years. For all of recorded human history, for every empire that has risen and fallen, for every war and every discovery, this mountain has simply stood there, silent, ancient, and forgotten. Geologists wrote it off decades ago. They called it dormant, a polite scientific word for something they believed was almost certainly dead. No seismic monitors watch its slopes. No emergency sirens wait in nearby towns. It sits so far from the modern world that, for years, almost nobody was paying attention to it at all. And that is exactly why what happened next is so unsettling. Because in the quiet, without warning, without a single tremor that anyone on the ground could feel, the so-called dead mountain began to rise. 9 centimeters, 3.5 inches. That is how far the summit of Taftan Volcano lifted itself into the sky between the summer of 2023 and the spring of 2024. It sounds small. It sounds like the kind of number you could shrug off, the kind of measurement that belongs in a spreadsheet rather than a headline. But to the scientists who found it, that quiet, steady swelling of solid rock was one of the most important warnings the Earth had given in years, because mountains are not supposed to grow, not like this, not without a reason buried deep beneath them, pushing upward, patient and relentless. Nobody on the ground felt it happen. There were no earthquakes strong enough to notice. No ash, no fire, no dramatic scene that would make it onto the evening news. The only reason anyone knows about it at all is because of something orbiting nearly 700 kilometers above the Earth's surface, sweeping over that same patch of desert again and again, patiently building a picture that no human eye on the ground could ever have assembled alone. This is the story of how we caught a mountain waking up. And it is also the story of a much bigger, much stranger truth. The Earth does not really have a word for dead, not when it comes to volcanoes. What we call extinction in geology might just be the longest, quietest pause imaginable, right before the next breath. To understand why this discovery sent a ripple of unease through the volcanology community, you first have to understand how we think about volcanoes, and how wrong that thinking might sometimes be. For most of us, a volcano falls into one of 3 neat categories. Active, meaning it has erupted recently and is being watched. Dormant, meaning it has been quiet for a long time but might wake up someday. Extinct, meaning it will never erupt again, full stop. Case closed, nothing to worry about. That third category is the one that gives people comfort. Extinct sounds final. Extinct sounds safe. You can build a town near an extinct volcano. You can farm its rich mineral soil. You can raise children in its shadow without a second thought, because extinct means the danger has been switched off forever. Except scientists have started to realize that this comforting tidy division might be one of the more dangerous illusions in modern geology. Volcanoes do not read our labels. The rock beneath them does not know that we have decided it is safe. Somewhere beneath Taftan and beneath dozens of other mountains scattered across the globe that we have confidently filed away as dormant or even extinct, something is still stirring. The fires may be low, the furnace may be nearly cold, but nearly cold is not the same as cold. And the machinery that built these mountains in the first place, the plumbing of heat, gas, and molten rock running deep into the planet's crust, does not simply switch off the moment eruptions stop being visible on the surface. Taftan sits in one of the loneliest corners of Iran, in the province of Sistan and Baluchistan, close to the border with Pakistan. It rises almost 4,000 meters above a stark, sunburned landscape, a towering stratovolcano built in layers of hardened lava and ash over unimaginable spans of time. It formed the way so many of the world's great volcanoes form, through the slow, grinding collision of tectonic plates, in this case, the Arabian Plate, sliding beneath the Eurasian Plate along what geologists call the Macron subduction zone. This process, patient beyond human comprehension, has been feeding molten rock upward into the crust for millions of years, building mountain after mountain along that boundary the way a bricklayer builds a wall one layer at a time, except each layer takes centuries. For most of its life, Taftan has not been silent in the way an extinct mountain should be silent. Its summit still vents sulfur-rich gas from cracks called fumaroles, plumes that people living in the nearby city of Kash have reported smelling for years, an acrid, unmistakable odor drifting down from the peak on certain winds. Anyone who has ever caught the scent of rotten eggs near a hot spring or a geothermal vent knows the smell instinctively. And it is the unmistakable signature of a system underground that is still hot, still active in some chemical sense, even if it has not produced an eruption that anyone alive has ever witnessed. Scientists have long known these fumaroles were there. What they did not know, until very recently, was that the ground beneath them had begun to move. The discovery did not come from a team standing on the mountain with seismometers and gas sensors, because there essentially were none. Taftan is too remote, too difficult to reach, too far outside the world's usual volcanic hotspots for that kind of dense, continuous, ground-based monitoring network that watches over more famous mountains like those in Italy, Japan, or the United States. Instead, The discovery came from space. A satellite mission called Sentinel-1, operated by the European Space Agency as part of its Copernicus program, has been quietly circling the planet, firing radar pulses down at the Earth's surface and recording how those pulses bounce back. This technique, known as INSAR, or Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar, allows scientists to detect changes in the shape of the ground with a precision that borders on the miraculous. We are talking about the ability to notice a shift in elevation of just a few millimeters across areas the size of entire countries, all without a single person setting foot on the ground. Think about what that actually means for a moment. A machine, hundreds of kilometers above the atmosphere, moving at thousands of kilometers per hour, is able to measure the swelling of a mountain's summit with more precision than a team of surveyors could achieve standing directly on top of it with instruments in hand. It is one of those quiet miracles of modern science that rarely makes headlines on its own, overshadowed by the dramatic discoveries it eventually leads to. But without it, nobody would have ever known that Taftan was moving at all. Even with that remarkable technology, the signal almost slipped through unnoticed, buried beneath noise. Satellite radar measurements are affected by all sorts of interference, especially from the atmosphere itself. Changes in humidity, temperature, and air pressure between the satellite and the ground can create false signals that mimic the appearance of the Earth's surface shifting, when in reality, nothing on the ground has changed at all. For years, this atmospheric noise made it difficult to separate real volcanic deformation from statistical illusion, especially in remote, poorly studied regions, where scientists had little baseline data to compare against. It took a newly developed filtering method, one designed specifically to strip away these atmospheric ghosts and isolate the true signal underneath, for researchers to finally see Taftan clearly. Once that filter was applied to years of accumulated satellite data, the picture that emerged was unambiguous. Between July of 2023 and May of 2024, the summit area of the mountain rose by roughly 9 centimeters, and it did not settle back down afterward the way ground sometimes does after temporary disturbance like heavy rain or a passing earthquake elsewhere. It rose and it stayed risen, holding steady, as if something beneath the surface had pushed upward and then simply stopped retreating. Researchers ruled out the obvious alternative explanations almost immediately. It was not caused by nearby seismic activity, because there had been no significant earthquakes in the region strong enough to trigger that kind of change. It was not caused by rainfall or groundwater shifts, the kind of thing that can sometimes cause soil to swell in ways that mimic volcanic behavior. What remained, after eliminating those possibilities one by one, was something more difficult to dismiss. Pressure was building beneath the summit of Taftan, and it was building from below, from deep within the plumbing of the volcano itself. Using mathematical models designed to simulate how pressure sources deform the rock above them, the scientific team estimated that the source of this uplift sat somewhere between 490 and 630 meters beneath the surface. That is remarkably shallow compared to where Taftan's main reservoir of molten rock is believed to sit, which based on the chemistry of its ancient lava flows appears to be roughly 3.5 kilometers down. In other words, whatever is causing this uplift is not necessarily a great surge of fresh magma racing toward the surface from the mountain's deep heart. It is something happening much closer to the top, in the volcano's shallow plumbing, the tangled network of cracks, gas pockets, and heated fluid that sits just beneath the fumaroles people have been smelling for years. This distinction matters enormously, and it is worth pausing to understand why. Not every kind of unrest inside a volcano leads to an eruption, and not every rising mountain is a countdown to disaster. Sometimes, gas and superheated fluid trapped in the shallow hydrothermal system of a volcano can build pressure, the same way steam builds pressure inside a sealed pot on a stove. It pushes, it swells, it vents, and eventually it finds a way to release itself, either gradually, through existing cracks and fumaroles, or in rarer cases, through a violent, sudden steam-driven blast that has nothing to do with molten lava breaching the surface at all. These are called hydrothermal eruptions, and they can be dangerous and unpredictable precisely because they do not follow the more familiar warning signs we associate with classic volcanic eruptions. There is no slow crescendo of magma forcing its way upward for months. Here can simply be a sudden explosive release of trapped steam and gas, catching anyone nearby completely off guard. This is not a hypothetical danger dreamed up to make for better television. In December of 2019, on White Island off the coast of New Zealand, a volcano long considered relatively low risk erupted suddenly in exactly this fashion. A steam-driven blast that gave almost no warning at all. Tourists were walking on the crater floor. At the time, drawn by tour operators promoting the otherworldly, alien landscape of an active volcanic vent. 22 people lost their lives, and dozens more were severely injured, many with horrific burns from the superheated steam and ash that engulfed them in seconds. The tragedy became a devastating reminder that even volcanoes considered well monitored. and even ones far less remote and far better. Studied than Taftan, can surprise the people standing on them with terrifying speed. If a monitored island volcano near a wealthy, technologically advanced nation could catch scientists and tourists off guard like that, what should we expect from an isolated mountain in a desert with no seismometers, no continuous gas sensors, and no dedicated observatory watching it at all? That question is precisely why the researchers behind the Taftan discovery, whose work was published in the scientific journal Geophysical Research Letters, were careful in their language, even as they underlined the seriousness of what they had found. They were not predicting an imminent eruption. They repeatedly emphasized that uplift alone does not mean disasters coming tomorrow or even this decade. What they were saying, in the careful, measured language of peer-reviewed science, was something more subtle and in some ways more unsettling. They were saying that a mountain we assumed was essentially inert has revealed, for the first time in the satellite era, unambiguous evidence that it is not inert at all. Something down there is changing. And because almost nobody is watching closely, we have no real way of knowing how fast that change might accelerate, or what it might eventually lead to. History has already handed us more than one lesson in why the word extinct should always be used with caution when it comes to volcanoes. For much of the 20th century, geologists confidently believed that a handful of Earth's most famous mountains had gone permanently silent, only to be proven wrong in the most dramatic way imaginable. Consider the long, sleepy history that came before Mount St. Helens tore itself apart in 1980. In the decades leading up to that eruption, many residents living in its shadow considered the mountain scenic and essentially harmless, a peaceful, snow-capped backdrop to daily life in the Pacific Northwest, even though geologists studying its deeper history knew it had a track record of violent behavior stretching back thousands of years. When it finally reawakened, the warning signs did arrive. Weeks of swelling and small earthquakes building toward the surface, but by the time the mountain's north face collapsed in the largest landslide ever recorded, taking 57 lives with it, the speed and scale of the transformation still caught much of the world off guard. The lesson volcanologists carried forward from that disaster was not simply about Mount St. Helens itself, but about the danger of complacency, about how quickly a mountain that seems merely picturesque can reveal itself to be something else entirely. A similar humbling lesson played out on the other side of the world at Pinatubo in the Philippines, a volcano so quiet for so many centuries that it barely registered on maps of active hazards before 1991. Local memory held no story of it ever erupting within living generations, and many geological surveys of the era gave it little more than a passing mention. Then, after months of building unrest that scientists scrambled to interpret in real time, it produced one of the largest eruptions of the entire 20th century, an explosion powerful enough to inject so much sulfur into the stratosphere that it measurably cooled the entire planet's average temperature for more than a year afterward. Communities that had built farms and towns around a mountain they never imagined as dangerous were forced to evacuate in a hurry, saved largely because scientists, learning from the hard lessons of prior disasters, pushed hard for those evacuations before the worst of the eruption arrived. Had the warning signs been dismissed even slightly longer, the death toll could have run into the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds. These stories matter here because they establish a pattern that Taftan and Utrunku now seem to be continuing. Time and again, the mountains that surprise us are not the famous, heavily monitored giants that dominate our textbooks and our disaster films. They are the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones nobody thought to watch closely because nothing in living memory suggested they needed watching at all. Every one of those historical surprises eventually pushed volcanology forward, refining the instruments, sharpening the models, expanding the list of mountains considered worthy of real attention. Taftan and Utrunku may simply be the latest entries in that same long, humbling education, proof once again that a silent mountain and a safe mountain are not always the same thing. The researchers called for exactly what you would expect scientists to call for in a moment like this: more monitoring, ground-based sensors, continuous observation, an actual volcano observatory dedicated to watching at Taftan the way observatories watch up Mount Etna or Kilauea or Mount St. Helens. Right now, satellites remain the only real-time window into what is happening on that mountain, sweeping overhead every few days, patiently gathering data that scientists on the other side of the world sift through months or years later. It is an extraordinary technological achievement that we can detect a mountain breathing from orbit. It is also a sobering reminder of just how thin our safety net really is when it comes to the thousands of volcanoes scattered across the planet that fall outside the handful of famous names we hear about again and again. Because here is the truly staggering part of the story. Taftan is not alone, not even close. Halfway across the world in the high, cold altitude of the Bolivian Andes, another so-called dead volcano has been making scientists uneasy for years. Its name is Uturunchu, and it has not erupted in more than 250,000 years, a span of time so vast it makes Taftan's dormancy look almost recent by comparison. Locals and scientists alike have nicknamed it the zombie volcano, a nod to the eerie way it seems to display all the signs of life without ever quite crossing the line into a full eruption. It shakes, gently and persistently but that careful, responsible scientific caution should not be mistaken for permission to stop paying attention. Because the deeper lesson embedded in both of these discoveries is not really about whether these two specific mountains will erupt next year, or next decade, or ever again in a form that matters. To anyone alive today, the deeper lesson is about how much we still do not know about the machinery running quietly beneath our feet across a planet where the vast majority of volcanic systems receive nowhere near the attention and instrumentation that the world's most famous volcanoes enjoy. For every Vesuvius, ringed with sensors and studied by generations of scientists precisely because of the catastrophic history looming over the millions of people living in its shadow there. The tools we now have, satellite radar capable of measuring millimeter scale changes in the shape of the Earth from hundreds of kilometers up, seismic imaging that lets us peer into the planet's interior the way a doctor peers into a human body, chemical analysis capable of detecting the faintest shifts in volcanic gas composition, represent an extraordinary leap forward in our ability to listen to a planet that has always been speaking, just in a language too slow and too quiet for us to hear without help. What Taftan and Uturunchu both demonstrate, in their own distinct ways, is that this language is far richer and far stranger than our old, simple categories ever allowed for. A volcano is not simply on or off, alive or dead, dangerous or safe. It exists somewhere on a vast, shifting spectrum of activity, most of which unfolds far too slowly and far too quietly for humans to notice without extraordinary technological help. Perhaps the most profound part of this whole story is not the specific science of pressure sources and fumaroles and interferometric radar. As fascinating as all of that genuinely is, perhaps the most profound part is what it reveals about the nature of the planet we live on. We tend to think of the Earth beneath our feet as fixed, as finished, as a stage upon which the drama of human history plays out while the ground itself simply holds still. But the Earth is not a stage. It is a participant. It is still forming, still shifting, still breathing on timescales so vast that entire human civilizations rise and fall within what amounts to a single one of its exhalations. The mountain that seems eternal to us, the one that has stood unchanged for the entire span of recorded history, might simply be resting between breaths, and we, with our satellites, and our radar and our patient, careful science, are only now developing the ability to notice the difference between true silence and the deep, slow inhale that comes right before a mountain speaks again. Somewhere in the deserts of Iran, a mountain that everyone assumed had gone quiet for good is still rising, patiently, without ash, without fire, without a single dramatic gesture. That would make it onto anyone's evening news, except to a handful of scientists poring over satellite data on the other side of the world, watching a needle move that nobody else can see. Somewhere in the Bolivian Andes, another mountain continues its restless, centuries-long shuffle, driven not by fresh fire from the depths, but by the slow circulation of ancient heat and fluid, still very much alive in its own strange, patient way, even after 250,000 years of what we mistakenly called death. And somewhere else, in dozens of locations we have not yet thought to look closely enough at, other mountains are almost certainly doing something similar right now, completely unnoticed, waiting for the day someone finally points the right instrument in their direction. We built our entire understanding of volcanic danger around the assumption that we would see the warning coming, that mountains announce their intentions loudly enough for us to prepare. What Taftan and Uturuncu are quietly teaching us is that some of the planet's oldest, most patient systems do not work that way at all. They rise a few centimeters at a time. They vent a little more gas than usual. They shake just slightly differently than the background noise around them. And unless something or someone is watching closely enough to notice, that quiet, patient rise can continue for years, completely unremarked, right up until the moment it isn't quiet anymore. The Earth has been trying to tell us something for as long as it has existed. We are only just now beginning to build the ears capable of truly listening.